Hi there, Misfits. I hope you're having a good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about how I develop an idea, how I take basically that first spark of what makes me want to write a story and turn it into a story worth writing. In a couple of recent blog posts, I have talked about like how you train your brain to find ideas and where you might possibly find them in the world. But then I know you might wonder, what next? What do I do after I have that idea? How do I turn it into something that I can write as a story? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, how I go through that process, because this process is different for everyone and your process might not end up looking like mine, but maybe my process will give you an idea of how to start. The first thing I do when I have an idea that I want to develop is I create the project. And what I mean is, I create a way in which to record my thoughts on that project and in which to develop the idea. Usually, at first, I try to do something that's not too formal, not too final, not too permanent, because I don't know if the idea is actually going to turn out into something that I want to make an entire book or book series about. So usually I will just start by creating a note document, maybe taking a few notes in like a regular notebook or in a planner. Right now, my favorite note taking tool is Notion, which I will link below. If you haven't heard of Notion, it is this like amazing, super flexible, do everything in your own way, make it work for your brain kind of tool. And I have been basically living in Notion for the last like 6 months. So that's kind of where I start because it's super flexible. I can easily turn it from like a little note into a big project without a problem, or I can just stay a little note if it's not ready to be developed. So when I'm first working on developing the idea into a story, I try and keep it super informal, super casual, so it doesn't feel like I'm having the burden of filling up this final project when this idea might not be able to be that. Then, once I know for sure that this is an idea that I want to turn into a book, I will create the more formal project, which usually for me means creating a Scrivener project, which is where I will either do or at least collect all of the writing and the research and everything that will end up being the final book and will keep me on track for an entire book, an entire series, an entire story world. So I create the project first, like in a really informal note taking tool, and then I create the final project, the more formal project in Scrivener. Once I have created that project, then it is time to actually start thinking about the idea. My first phase is really a lot of thinking and pondering and brainstorming and just wondering lots of what ifs about the characters and the stories that might happen in this world and the world itself. I will link below to a blog post I wrote about how to turn an idea into a story that includes several brainstorming techniques that you could use and a free workbook that you can download. Um, but basically, I just spend this time using a lot of different brainstorming techniques to make lists or mind maps or snippets of dialogue or whatever is gonna just like spur me to think more about this idea and ways that it might develop into an actual story. Once I have finished that brainstorming phase, which never really finishes, but once I feel like I've done it enough to have kind of a grounding in what this book is going to be, then I start building out basically Nancy Pearl's Four Doors to Reading. I'll link below to a post I wrote about that, but basically, the four doors to reading are character, plot, world, and language. And I don't do a lot of thinking ahead of time about language. Like I might during the writing process, but especially in the revision process. But for developing the story, I definitely think a lot about the characters, the plot, and the world. And once I've done my initial brainstorming, I really try to start fleshing those three areas out to get closer to it becoming an actual story. When I start developing the characters, one of the first things I always do is I find inspiration images. I will search for actors or models that I think look like what I imagine the character to look like. And I will definitely pop those right into either my note or my Scrivener document so that I have this constant reminder of what I think this character looks like. I will also fill out character charts to some extent. I don't fill them out extensively or even usually completely. One of my favorites right now is the character tree that was developed by film critic Hulk, which I think I wrote a blog post about, and I'll link to that. And there's a downloadable worksheet for that too. But it really just makes me think about different aspects of my character, not just what they look like or who I basically think they are right now, but about what they want in life and what they really need in life, which may not be what they want, and things like that. So I use those to kind of spark questions that I can answer about my characters, if that makes sense. Um, Another thing I like to use just to kind of develop like unique and diverse and different characters so they don't all seem the same is I'll use like a personality profile to apply to them, which by that I mean like a zodiac sign, like their astrological sign. I'll look up what certain traits of each sign are and be like, oh, that would be a good set of traits to apply to that character. Or you could look at something like the Myers-Briggs personality test types. Um, One of my favorites to use is a book called the Heroes and Heroines Archetype Book, which I'll include the link below, which has 8 different archetypes for male and female characters. It's primarily targeted at the romance reader, the romance writer, but I think that the character types are applicable in all types of stories. Those are the tools and techniques that I'll use to develop a character to get them ready to be in this story world. After I have done my initial character development, I will start working on fleshing out the plot. Now, I am never very good at figuring out an entire plot before I start writing because some of the best things and most exciting things in stories, for me at least, come up in the moment of when I'm writing them. So I can't exactly plan for those because I have to be in that moment for that idea to come to me. But I do like to have at least a basic outline overview of what is going to happen in the story so that I know where I'm going. And to do that, I usually start off by looking at different kinds of structure guides. And I mean, different plot structures that writing gurus have developed over the years. And I use those not as like a specific roadmap, like this thing has to happen at the midpoint, this thing has to happen 3/4 of the way through, but more of like an inspiration. And I'll look at a point and be like, oh, the inciting incident. Yes, there needs to be something that kicks off this story and makes it start happening. So, what could that be in my story? So, while I don't use it as a specific roadmap, like beat by beat, moment by moment, I do use it to inspire like story ideas in my head. The two of my favorites that I use most frequently are Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, which is for screenwriters, but is totally applicable to novel storytelling as well. And Dan Wells' 7 Point Plot Structure, which is a video series that I will link to below, where he talks about using the Matrix as an example, like basically 7 plot points to develop your story and in what order to develop them. And anyway, I find that really useful. So Save the Cat and Dan Wells' 7 Point Plot Structure are my two favorites when I am trying to brainstorm my plot before I write the book. And then the third door I develop after characters and plot is the story world. Now, this is definitely one of my favorite parts about writing in general, and one of the reasons I write fantasy is because I get to create way more elaborate worlds than if I was writing a contemporary book. Um, but basically, that means I'm trying to figure out what the setting is, if there's magic, what the rules are, like where it comes from, how it's used, maybe even what the history of this world is and how that might affect the story that I'm going to write. So a lot of these things, just like the plot points, will come up when I'm writing and when I'm actually in that moment of the story world. But it definitely helps to get my creative juices flowing to think about them before I dive in and think about this world that I'm about to put my characters in and myself in for the duration of writing this book or this series. Another thing I like to do in my story development phase is to think about transmedia aspects of this story. What that means to me is that I love creating things that are for this story world that are beyond just the book. So Could be something like a website for a, super private school for the Greek gods, or social media accounts for the characters, or blogs or vlogs even by the characters, or maybe one of the characters is a musician and he's going to release an album. Like all of those things, especially those things that make the story world, my fantasy story world, feel real within our actual world. So this also makes the story world and these characters feel more real to me, which means I can understand them more and their world and what's about to happen in it. So that's definitely part of my brainstorming process, is thinking about things that aren't just in the story, that won't be just in the book, but that could be part of this like bigger story universe. Then finally, after I've done all of those things, I will just start writing. Even if I'm not fully ready, even if I don't know exactly what the book is going to be, or I'm still not entirely sure about this idea, sometimes I don't feel like I can really get a handle on an idea until I actually start writing it, until I actually start putting words on the paper, putting words in characters' mouths. I'll either pick like a fun moment that I think could be the opening of the story and just start writing from that and see where that leads. Or one thing I really like to do is I will write from the point of view of a character and basically have them telling me their story, like as if they're writing a letter to me about themselves. So I get to be kind of in their head and learn what that character would want to say to me for me to know to tell their story to the world, if that makes sense. And usually when I do this dive in writing without really know where I'm going, I'll get through about a few thousand words, maybe three or four, and then I will hit a wall and not know where to go next. And that's when I will go back to the brainstorming and the plotting and the character development to try and figure out that thing that's keeping me from going forward, that's keeping me from just finishing the rest of the book. So I'll use that dive in writing to just kind of get a little breakthrough and then go back and finish the development work before I then can continue to finish the story. So that is basically how I develop an idea into a story. And this process really changes a lot from book to book, series to series. Like some need more character development before, some need more world, some need plot. I'm always looking for the next great plot structure, the one that will give me all those answers right up front, even though I know it doesn't exist, but I keep hoping that one day it will happen. But until then, I will keep tinkering away on my process and tinkering my way through. And hopefully, this video has given you some ideas for how you might tinker your own way through on your writing project. And there are countless other ways to do it, not just the ways that I've outlined here. And this is just my process. But as you start writing, you're going to develop your own process along the way, which again will change from book to book or series to series, and even just over time as you change as a writer. But I don't want you to be afraid to use the tools or teachings of others as like a starting point, like in the same way that I will use a, save the cat beat sheet to inspire my plotting, not necessarily dictate it. But definitely feel free to use the ideas that others use to develop them so that you can get a jump start on your writing process. So that's everything I have to say about how I develop an idea into a story. So until next time, stay magical.